Payback times.
The printer was making that sound again, not the grinding complaint it made when the paper tray was low, and not the rhythmic thunk of a stapled jam. This was a different sound, a kind of hesitant stutter, like it was reconsidering what it was about to do. I'd been ignoring it for 20 minutes, too deep in the kerning adjustments on slide 14 of the Luminera skincare deck to care about whatever the machine's existential crisis was. The pitch was in 9 days. Harlan had already moved it up once, 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the 22nd floor was mine alone. The cleaning crew had come and gone around 9, leaving the faint lemon ammonia smell that always made me think of hospitals. The city below was still doing what cities do, ambulance lights threading through the grid, the elevated train throwing sparks near the Millbrook overpass, 1,000 lit rectangles of other people's late nights stacked against the dark. I'd stopped finding it lonely years. Ego. Now, it just felt like company that didn't require anything from me. I hit print on the supplemental brand audit, pushed back from my desk, and walked to the printer station in the alcove off the main corridor to collect it. There were 2 documents in the tray. The brand audit was on top, warm and smelling of toner, 32 pages fanned slightly from the feed mechanism. I grabbed it and was already turning back to my office when I noticed the second document underneath. Heavier paper stock, not our standard copy weight. Someone had loaded the executive tray without clearing the queue, which meant something had been sitting in the network spool, waiting for the machine to come back online after its stutter. I picked it up, intending to take it to the executive wing. Harlan's assistant, Petra, sat 2 doors down from his corner office. I'd slip it under her door. I read the first line, non-compete enforcement strategy, Q4 talent retention, confidential, prepared, for H. Drexel, CEO. Then the second line, the purpose of this memorandum is to outline the phased implementation of expanded restrictive covenant agreements for all senior creative personnel to be executed during the Q4 annual review cycle under the framing of an employment partnership addendum. I kept standing there in the alcove for another few seconds, the brand audit tucked under my arm, this document in my hands, the printer making its settling sounds around me. Then I walked back to my office, sat down, and read every page. It took 11 minutes, I know because I checked my phone when I finished, and then I checked the timestamp on my email draft still open in another window, and the math was 11 minutes. 11 minutes to understand what Harlan Drexel had been building, while the rest of us were building his agency's revenue. The memo was thorough. I'll give whoever drafted it that much. Petra's predecessor had a paralegal background, and I'd always suspected he'd retained some kind of outside HR counsel. This had the fingerprints of both. Operationally precise, legally dressed up, but not quite lawyer-tight in the places that mattered. The plan was clean in outline. During the upcoming annual reviews, every senior creative at Pinnacle and Drake would be presented with a 2-page addendum to their existing employment agreement. The addendum would be accompanied by a one-time bonus of $2,000, framed in all internal communications as a loyalty reward, recognition of their contributions, appreciation for their partnership, that kind of language. The bonus would be contingent on signing. The addendum itself would expand the existing non-compete provisions in every senior employee's contract. The new terms: no competing creative, marketing, or advertising work of any kind within a 150-mile radius of the agency's primary office location for a period of 36 months following separation from the company for any reason. I set the document on my desk, picked it back up, read that section again. 150 miles, 36 months. There was a section near the back that stopped my breath. A list, formatted as a table, labeled Priority Targets, High Revenue Generators, 12 names, mine was 4th. Selene Vasquez-Okafor. Annual Billable Attribution, $2.3 million. Current NCA terms, 12 months, 50-mile radius. Risk Assessment, High. Mitigation, Priority, Immediate. I sat with that for a moment. The city glittered. A cab laid on its horn 14 stories below, and the sound reached me thin and distant, like something happening in another world. The printer had gone quiet. I did not move for 3 full minutes. I know this too because I was watching the clock on my laptop screen and I made myself a small private bet. I will not react until that minute changes twice. It changed twice. Then I opened my desk drawer, took out my personal phone, and photographed. Every page of the document, 12 photographs. I checked each one for legibility, zoomed in on the table with my name in it, made sure the header with Harlan's name was clean and clear. Then I put the memo back exactly where I'd found it. in the tray under my brand audit, and carried both documents to the executive wing. Petra's light was off. I slid the memo under her door and walked back to my desk. My hands were completely steady. That's the thing about having worked in employment law for 8 years. The fury doesn't arrive as heat, it arrives as clarity. I opened the cloud folder I'd maintained since my attorney days, a habit so ingrained I'd never bothered to break it. Every employment document I'd ever signed, scanned and stored in a personal folder that lived nowhere near any company server. Offer letters, benefit summaries, the non-disclosure I'd signed at my second firm, and yes, my Pinnacle and Drake employment agreement, executed 4 years ago when Harlan had recruited me out of Callaway Creative with a salary bump and a promise that I'd have real authority over the agency's flagship accounts. I opened the agreement and navigated to Section 9. There it was. My existing non-compete clause, 12 months, 50-mile radius, limited to direct competitors in the advertising and marketing sector. I'd read it 4 years ago, at the kitchen table in my apartment with a glass of Tempranillo and the particular professional detachment you develop after years of reviewing contracts for other people. I'd thought, this is on the aggressive side, but it's not unreasonable. The geography is contained. The time frame is defensible. I'd signed it because the opportunity was real and the terms weren't designed to trap me. They were designed to protect a legitimate business interest. What Harlan was proposing now was something different entirely. I opened a new document on my personal laptop, not my work machine, never my work machine for this, and started annotating. Non-compete clauses are not automatically enforceable just because you signed one. I'd explained this to clients more times than I could count, usually to the person who'd already signed something they didn't understand and was now sitting across from me with a job offer from a competitor and the slowly dawning realization that they might be stuck. Courts don't rubber stamp restrictive covenants, they examine them. The analysis comes down to 4 factors, and every one of them has to hold up. Geographic scope, time duration, legitimate business interest, reasonable necessity. The first 2 were the easiest to see. 150 miles covered not just the metro area, but 3 neighboring cities with their own thriving agency markets, plus a significant stretch of suburban and regional markets where mid-sized companies hired independent creative directors regularly. 36 months was 3 years. 3 years is not protecting a business. 3 years is punishment. But those were the obvious problems. The more interesting question was legitimate business interest, because that's where employers always thought they had more room than they did. What legitimate interest was Harlan protecting? Trade secrets? Our client relationships were documented in systems that remained the agency's property when you left. He already owned that. Proprietary methodologies? We were an advertising agency. There are only so many ways to position a skincare brand. Specialized training? Harlan hadn't invested $1 in my professional development in 2 years. I made a note. Breadth of restriction must be proportional to the interest being protected, covering all advertising and marketing work, not just work for direct competitor agencies, not just work on accounts I'd personally touched, was not proportional to any interest I could identify. It was a dragnet, a cage with a $2,000 lock, which brought me to the consideration problem. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling. This was the part that would matter most for my colleagues, the ones who didn't have my background, and would see the bonus as the agency being generous, and would sign before they'd finished reading the first paragraph. Consideration. Contracts require it. Both parties have to give something of value. In the original employment agreement, the consideration was mutual and obvious. I gave my labor and expertise. The agency gave salary, benefits, and the opportunity to work on significant accounts. That's a clean exchange. But when an employer wants to add a new restrictive covenant to an existing employment relationship, something they didn't ask for when you first signed, the rules get complicated. In many states, continued employment alone is not sufficient consideration for a dramatically expanded non-compete. You're already employed. They can't threaten to fire you and then claim the threat's removal was something of value they gave you. The courts have seen that move, so you attach a bonus. $2,000 presented as a gift, a reward, a token of appreciation. It feels generous. It feels like the company is giving you something. And in some states, it might technically satisfy the consideration requirement, a nominal payment tied to a new agreement. But in others, courts have looked at the disparity between what's being given and what's being taken, $2,000 in exchange for a 36-month restriction on your ability to earn a living in your entire professional field within a 150-mile radius, and called it unconscionable. The consideration has to be real. It has to be proportionate to the burden being imposed. $2,000. My annual billing attribution was $2.3 million. The math was not subtle. I kept annotating. There was more to think through. The question of whether the addendum would be presented as a condition of continued employment or as a true opt-in, whether the review meeting setting created any kind of implicit coercion, whether the state's specific statute had a blue penciling provision that would let a court rewrite an overreaching clause rather than void it entirely. Blue penciling cuts both ways. Sometimes it saves an employer from their own excess. Sometimes it doesn't matter, because even the penciled down version fails the reasonableness test. I worked until the clock on my laptop read 2:07 a.m. Then I saved the file, encrypted it, and closed the personal laptop. The work meeting was in 6 hours. I made myself a cup of instant coffee from the emergency supplies I kept in my bottom drawer. The good stuff was in the kitchen 2 floors down, and I wasn't walking past the printer again tonight, and stood at the window while I drank it. The city had settled into its 2 a.m. register, slower and stranger, the grid half-lit and patient. I thought about the clients I'd had, the ones who'd come in after a layoff, clutching their severance agreement with one hand and a new job offer with the other, asking me to tell them they were free. Sometimes I could. Sometimes the clause was sloppy or overbroad and we could get them clear. Sometimes the clause was well drafted and the answer was, you knew what you signed and now you have choices to make. Harlan was banking on the second scenario. He was betting that nobody would read carefully enough to know the difference. He was betting that the combination of the review cycle, already stressful, already laden with the annual performance anxiety that made even the most senior people feel newly uncertain about their standing, and the carrot of the bonus would be enough to move 23 signatures through in 3 weeks. He was also betting that none of his senior creatives knew enough employment law to understand what they were giving up. That was the bet I intended to break. I sat back down, opened the staff directory on my screen, and counted 23 senior employees across creative, copy, strategy, and production. Some of them had been here longer than I had. Some of them had mortgages and kids in school and the specific financial terror that makes a $2,000 bonus feel like a lifeline rather than a hook. Some of them, most of them, would walk into that review room and sign before Harlan finished his opening remarks. Marcus would be the first. I already knew it. Marcus Webb, our head copywriter, had been here 6 years and was pathologically incapable of leaving money on the table or saying no to anything that felt like validation from above. He was brilliant and warm and so relentlessly eager to be appreciated that he'd once thanked Harlan for a parking rate increase because Harlan had framed it as the agency's investment in employee convenience. I had watched this happen. I had watched Marcus nod along, genuinely moved. Marcus would sign, and then others would see Marcus sign and feel the social permission that comes from watching the most trusted voice in the room agree to something, and they would sign, and by the time anyone realized what the clause actually said, the ink would be 3 weeks dry. He's counting on everyone being too grateful, too tired, or too intimidated to read what they're signing. I looked at my phone. Almost 1:14 a.m. My thumb hovered over the contacts for a moment. Then I found the name I was looking for and typed, "We need to talk. Not on company channels. Tomorrow morning, coffee at Vero's." I hit send before I could think about it more than I already had. Then I closed everything down, gathered my things, and rode the elevator to the parking garage. The building was so quiet I could hear the cables. In the car, sitting in the dark before I started the engine, I let myself feel it for exactly 30 seconds. The thing under the clarity, the thing that had been there since I'd read my name on that list. Priority target, high revenue generator, risk assessment, high. I had spent 8 years of my professional life helping people navigate exactly this kind of leverage. I knew how it worked. I knew the playbook better than Harlan did, better than whoever he'd hired to draft that memo, better than any of the 23 people whose names were in that staff directory. I used to represent people exactly like him. I started the car. I know every move he's about to make. Vero's opened at 6:30, and I was there at 6:28, standing on the sidewalk outside with my coat collar up against the October bite, watching the owner, a small, precise woman named Lucia, who had never once acknowledged that she recognized me despite 3 years of visits, flip the sign from closed to open, with the same expression she brought to everything, which is to say, no expression at all. Inside, I ordered 2 espressos and took the corner table in the back, the one with the cracked leather seat and the angle that let me see both the door and the counter. Old lawyer habit. You always want to see who's coming. Priya arrived at 6:40, unwinding a burgundy scarf with one hand and already talking. That was Priya. She didn't ease into things. I looked up the precedents last night after your text, she said, dropping into the chair across from me and wrapping both hands around the espresso I'd ordered for her. Your state is not employer-friendly on this. The appellate record is actually quite good. Good morning to you, too. Good morning, show me the memo. I slid my personal phone across the table with the photos pulled up. Priya worked through them the way I would have, systematically, expression neutral, occasionally scrolling back to reread something. She had the particular stillness of someone whose job required her to absorb bad information without broadcasting a reaction. I watched the slight tightening around her eyes when she hit the priority targets table. And this is your original agreement? She picked up the 2-page printout I'd made at home that morning. My actual contract, the one from 4 years ago, Section 9 highlighted in yellow. 12 months, 50-mile radius, I said. Which is defensible. Aggressive, but defensible. She set it down. What they're proposing is neither. She handed my phone back. The scope problem is the most obvious one. 150 miles, covering all advertising and marketing work. Not just direct competitors, not just accounts you've touched, not just clients you have relationships with. That's not a non-compete. That's a professional exile order. No court in this state is going to look at that and call it reasonable. The duration is the second problem. 36 months, yes. The standard our courts apply is whether the restriction is narrowly tailored to protect a legitimate business interest. 3 years is a long time to argue. You're protecting anything except market position. She took a long sip of espresso. And then there's the consideration question. $2,000. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. For a 36-month restriction on a woman billing $2.3 million annually, Priya Menon would like to introduce that math into evidence. So we're in agreement. It's unenforceable. Almost certainly, under the applicable precedents, yes. She set her cup down and looked at me steadily. But Selene, you know what unenforceable means in practice. I did. But I let her say it anyway. It means you're right. It also means that if he decides to sue, you spend the next 18 months of your life and somewhere between $60,000 and $100,000 in legal fees being right. That's his actual weapon, not the contract, the cost of challenging him. She turned her cup in a small circle on the table. Most people, when faced with that calculation, fold. That's what those cease and desist letters are for. He doesn't need the clause to hold up. He just needs people to believe it might. The morning light was coming through Vero's front window at a low angle, catching the dust on the pastry case and turning it almost beautiful. I thought about Dara, whose name I'd found in a file I'd pulled from my memory at 1 a.m., a creative director who'd left Pinnacle and Drake 2 years ago and, according to agency gossip, had scaled back her independent work considerably after receiving a letter from the agency's outside counsel. I hadn't been able to confirm the full story yet, but the memo had mentioned her. Past enforcement examples, successful. What would I need, I said, to make it a clean fight? If it came to that, Priya considered. Documentation of the signing environment. If employees were led to believe the addendum was a condition of continued employment rather than a true opt-in, that matters. Evidence that the bonus was presented as contingent on signing, not as a standalone reward. And a pattern. If there's a history of using these threats to restrict former employees' actual livelihood, that builds the picture of bad faith. She paused. Witnesses help. People who can say, I was in that room, I was told I needed to sign, I was not told I could negotiate. I had already started a list in my head. I took out my personal phone and started a note. I'll need to be careful about how I approach colleagues, I said. Extremely careful. You're not their attorney. You can share information. You can ask questions. You cannot give legal advice in a way that creates a professional relationship you're not prepared to maintain. I know where the line is. I know you know. I'm saying it out loud anyway, because I like you, and I don't want to be visiting you in a bar complaint proceeding. She softened it with a slight smile. What's your timeline? Annual reviews start in 3 weeks. I've already moved mine to the last slot. I looked at my notes. I have maybe 2.5 weeks before it becomes urgent for the others. Priya nodded slowly. Then let's get to work. We spent another 40 minutes at that corner table, espresso going cold, going through the legal memo structure she'd helped me build, the statutory language, the relevant case citations, the specific failures of the proposed addendum mapped against the 4-factor enforceability test. I took notes on my personal phone. I did not write Priya's name anywhere near them. When we left, she hugged me briefly on the sidewalk and said, "Don't sign anything," which was so obvious it was almost funny, except that she meant it as shorthand for something larger. Don't let him move faster than you. I walked to the office in the cold, thinking about the 23 names in the staff directory, the list I built that evening at home on my personal laptop with a glass of Tempranillo that I mostly didn't drink was more than a head count. I thought about each person the way I used to think about potential clients. What's their situation? What's their threshold? What would make them sign without reading? What would make them push back? Seniority helps. Financial stability helps more. The people who are most vulnerable in this kind of situation are the ones who can't afford to test the question of whether a clause is enforceable because the testing itself costs too much. I identified 7 people I trusted. Then I cut that to 4, applying a stricter standard. Not just trust, but trust plus judgment, plus the likelihood that they'd keep a quiet conversation quiet. In my experience, those 2 qualities don't always travel together. Theo Barros, art director, 8 years at the agency, no mortgage, famously skeptical of institutional anything. He'd once spent 20 minutes in a creative review explaining why a brand's loyalty program was architecturally designed to extract data rather than reward customers. He'd be receptive. Lynn Nakamura, strategist, 12 years in the industry, 6 here. She had twins in middle school and a precise awareness of her own financial situation that made her both cautious and clear-eyed. She'd want information. She'd act on it. Jerome Okeke, production director. He was the one I was least certain about. Jerome ran warm and was inclined to think well of people, including Harlan, but he was also meticulous, and he read everything, which meant if I could get him to read the right things, he'd arrive at his own conclusions. And then there was the 4th. I won't name her here, even in my own account of things, because she's the one who went to Harlan, but I'd calculated for that. A 25% defection rate in a group of 4 isn't optimistic, but it's honest, and the critical thing was that she had nothing to take with her. I'd asked her only a question. Had she read her original non-compete carefully? I had shown her nothing, given her nothing, said nothing. She couldn't have heard from anyone with a general sense of self-preservation. If she reported that Selene Vasquez-Okafor had asked whether she'd read her contract, Harlan could work with that. He couldn't work with much else. I approached them all in the week following the Vero's meeting, individually, off-site, no company devices, Theo first, over lunch at the Japanese place 3 blocks east, that nobody from the agency ever went to because the seating was uncomfortable and the lighting was bad. I asked him the question. Had he read his non-compete carefully and watched him frown? I read it when I signed it. He said, 4 years ago. Why? When they present you with the new addendum during your review, you might want to read that carefully too before you sign it. They said it was a standard update. Does your original agreement say 50 miles or 150? The frown deepened. 50. Right. He was quiet for a moment, picking apart a piece of edamame. How different is the new one? This was the moment I'd thought through most carefully. I wasn't his attorney. I could share information. I couldn't advise him. The line was genuinely thin, and I had to walk it without looking like I was walking it. I think you should look at your original agreement tonight, I said, specifically the non-compete section, and then when you see the addendum, you should compare them. If there are changes that feel significant, scope, duration, what activities are covered, you're allowed to ask questions. You're allowed to ask for time. You're allowed to have someone else look at it. Someone like a lawyer. Someone like whatever resource makes sense to you. He looked at me directly. Selene, what's in the new one? I think you should read it yourself and form your own view. He accepted this, which told me his instincts were working correctly. He didn't need me to hand him a conclusion. He needed to know there was something to look for. Lynn was easier. She met me for coffee on a Thursday morning, pre-agency, and when I asked the question, she immediately said, I've been meaning to pull mine out since they announced the reviews. Honestly, whenever Harlan does anything that comes with a bonus attached, I want to read the small print. That instinct is correct. How bad is it? I told her what I could, the scope, the duration, the structure of the bonus as consideration, not as legal advice, as a former attorney who was also her colleague, sharing professional context. Lynn pulled out her phone while I was talking and started doing her own math on the geography. 150 miles, she said. That's half the state. Closer to a third, but yes, and they're calling this a loyalty reward. They are. Right. She put her phone away. I'm calling my husband's attorney tomorrow. He does employment work. Jerome took the most careful handling. I met him for drinks on a Friday. His idea. He'd suggested it himself when I asked if he had time to catch up. And I started 3 conversations back from the topic to let him arrive somewhere close on his own. We talked about the annual reviews in general. We talked about how he felt about the agency's direction. When he mentioned the addendum, I simply asked what he understood it to cover. They said it was mostly updating the non-compete. He said, bringing it in line with current industry standards. What are the current terms in your original agreement? He thought about it. I want to say 12 months. I'd have to look. Do that, I said. And when you see the new terms, whatever they are, compare them directly. If you have questions about whether the changes are material, that's worth a conversation with someone who can help you evaluate it. He nodded. He was already pulling at something in his expression, the beginning of recalibration. Jerome didn't like being wrong about people, but he was honest enough to update his assessments when the evidence shifted. The 4th conversation happened on a Wednesday afternoon, over coffee in a nearby cafe, and went fine. She seemed engaged, asked a few questions, took nothing away with her that I hadn't intended to give. 2 days later, Harlan's assistant sent me an email requesting a one-on-one. I'd expected it. I'd accelerated 2 things in the preceding 48 hours just in case: the outline of Priya's legal memo, which was now in a 2nd draft, and my outreach to Dara. I found Dara through a combination of LinkedIn and a former colleague who'd stayed in touch with her. Her profile was sparse. A few freelance projects, a consulting reference that was careful about naming clients. The scaling back the gossip had mentioned was real and visible in the gaps. I sent her a message through a personal email account I maintained separately from anything professional, kept it brief, said only that I was a former colleague at Pinnacle and Drake who had reason to believe a pattern she might have experienced was repeating itself, and that I'd welcome a conversation if she was open to it. She replied within 4 hours. Yes, call me. We talked for an hour that evening. Dara Washington had been a senior creative director, 1 level below me in the current structure, who'd left 2 years ago to go independent. She'd had a client prospect lined up, a regional retail chain that the agency had pitched and lost. 3 weeks after she left, she'd received a letter from an outside law firm representing Pinnacle and Drake, informing her that her consultation with the retail client potentially violated her non-compete clause and that the agency was prepared to seek injunctive relief. The clause in my original agreement covered a 50-mile radius, she said. Her voice was measured, careful, the voice of someone who had been careful about this for 2 years. And the client was 47 miles from the agency office, so technically, she paused, but I didn't have the money to fight it. I had just gone out on my own. I had maybe 4 months of runway, so I told the client I couldn't work with them. And then I told myself I'd just stay outside the radius going forward. But you scaled back more than that. A silence. When you get a letter like that, you start seeing threats everywhere. I got one more inquiry from a company that was 60 miles out, and I turned it down because I couldn't risk another letter. I couldn't afford the fear. Another pause. I lost probably $150,000 in billings over the following year because I was playing smaller than I had to. I thought about the memo on Harlan's list. Past enforcement examples, successful. Success defined as subject complied. Subject's compliance was the compliance of someone who couldn't afford to find out whether the clause would hold up. It wasn't a legal victory. It was a financial one. Dara, I said carefully, would you be willing to put any of this in writing? Not for legal proceedings necessarily, not yet. Just a factual account of what you were told and what you changed as a result. Another silence, longer this time. What are you building? A record, I said, of a pattern. She agreed. She'd send me something within the week. Harlan's office was on the 24th floor, separated from the rest of the creative department by a small reception area and a set of glass doors that were etched with the agency's logo in a sans serif font I privately found overconfident. I'd been in that office many times. It always smelled like the same sandalwood candle, and the cold water and stone smell of the air conditioning running at full power, regardless of the weather outside. He was standing when I came in, which he always did when he wanted the first 30 seconds to be about the physical dynamic, the room, his position in it, the window behind him with its view of the city that was fractionally better than the view from my office. I understood the staging. I'd used it myself, in different rooms, for different purposes. Selene, He gestured to the chairs. "Thanks for making time." "Of course." I sat. I kept my face arranged in the expression I used for client meetings, where the client was being difficult, but hadn't fully understood yet that they were being difficult. He talked for a few minutes about the agency's performance, the Luminara pitch timeline, the fourth quarter numbers. He was good at this, the warm-up, the reminder that things were going well, the implicit message that the going well was connected to him and by extension to our relationship. Then he settled back in his chair and shifted registers. "I heard there's been some chatter," he said. "People asking questions about the new addendum. Nothing wrong with questions." The warmth in his voice didn't change, but the texture underneath it did. The way a hardwood floor sounds different when there's nothing under it. "I just want to make sure people have the right information, from the right sources." "That's reasonable," I said. "You've been here long enough to know that the agency's strength is its people, and that means we have to protect what we build together." He leaned forward slightly. "Selene, you're one of the most valuable people in this building. I'd hate for a misunderstanding to get in the way of what we've built together. The new agreement is standard industry stuff. Everyone's signing. It just protects both of us. Both of us." I kept my expression warm and attentive. Then he said it, leaning back, voice still easy, eyes not quite matching the ease. "A woman with your background should understand that loyalty has a paper trail." There it was. It wasn't a threat, technically. Nothing he'd said was a threat, technically. It was the kind of sentence that a reasonable person in a deposition might describe as a general observation about professional documentation. But in context, in this office, in this conversation, after a week of what I knew he knew, it was exactly what it was. A reminder that he had resources, that he knew how to use institutional weight, that my background cut both ways. I knew enough to be dangerous to him, and he knew enough to make the danger mutual. I smiled. Not my real smile, my other one, the one that had worked in a dozen depositions and twice as many settlement negotiations. "I appreciate your confidence in me," I said, "and honestly, having my background means I just want to make sure I understand everything fully before I sign anything. Standard due diligence. You'd expect that from me, I think." He looked at me for a moment. "Of course," he said, in a tone that meant the opposite. I walked out of his office with my pulse at approximately twice its resting rate, and my face completely still. In the elevator back to 22, I stood alone and breathed through it. Not fear, not exactly. The specific elevated state of being in a contest with someone who has more institutional power than you and has just shown you exactly how willing they are to use it. A paper trail, fine. I was building one. In the days that followed, Priya and I completed the legal memo, 14 pages, annotated with case citations, mapping each element of the proposed addendum against the 4-factor enforceability test. I helped Theo draft 3 questions to ask during his review meeting before he signed anything. I worked through Lynn's original contract with her over the phone on a Sunday afternoon, identifying the specific language that differentiated her current clause from the proposed one, helping her understand what a fair version of the expansion might look like. "So what should it look like?" she asked, "if the new one was actually reasonable?" I thought about how to answer this without telling her what to do. A non-compete that's genuinely designed to protect a business interest rather than eliminate competition would look pretty specific. A defined list of direct competitors, not all advertising and marketing work, but the actual named agencies or client categories where the agency has a real competitive vulnerability, a time frame of 12 months, maybe 18 in extreme cases, not 3 years, a geographic scope tied to actual client territory, and the consideration, what you get in exchange, would need to be real, not a one-time bonus that amounts to less than 0.1% of your annual billing value. Can you actually negotiate that? They make it sound like it's take it or leave it. "Everything is negotiable before you sign it," I said. "The leverage disappears once your signature is on the page, but before that, especially when you have value to the organization, you have more room than they want you to believe." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been here 6 years, and I've never pushed back on a single employment term. A lot of people haven't. The assumption is that the employer sets the terms, and employees accept them. But an employment agreement is a contract. Both parties have to agree. And if the terms being proposed are materially different from what you originally accepted, you're under no obligation to treat that as a foregone conclusion." 3 days before my own review, I got a message from Marcus. He'd signed the addendum the previous afternoon. Full terms, no modifications. He'd texted me a photo of himself with his bonus check and a string of celebration emojis. I sat with that for a long moment. Marcus, who was brilliant and trusting and completely unaware of what he'd just handed over, the part of me that had spent 8 years in employment law wanted to call him immediately. The strategic part of me understood that Marcus's signed addendum was now evidence of the signing environment, of the bonus framing, of the social pressure that came from being told everyone was signing. I couldn't undo what he'd done, but I could make sure it counted for something. I noted the date and saved his text. The morning of my review, I dressed deliberately. Dark navy, structured, the kind of clothes that are armor without announcing themselves as armor. Priya had messengered me a sealed copy of the completed legal memo 2 days prior. Dara's written statement had arrived by email, 3 careful paragraphs describing what she'd been told and what she'd lost. I had printed both, along with my annotated original contract, a timeline of every company, communication referencing the loyalty program, and documentation of the date. The bonus was first framed as contingent on signing. An email from Harlan's assistant that had gone to all senior staff and used the precise phrase, "A bonus of $2,000 will be issued upon execution of the updated agreement. Upon execution, not alongside, not separately, upon." The folder was organized by argument. I knew the order I'd place things in front of him if the conversation went the way I expected it to. I walked into the 24th floor at 2:15 p.m. Harlan was sitting at his conference table rather than his desk, which was a small choice designed to feel collaborative. There was a copy of the addendum at my seat, signature page on top, a pen resting across it at an angle that was almost artistic. He was warm, he was confident, he made 2 jokes. He recapped the year, my numbers, my accounts, the Luminara work, all of it positive. He was building toward the moment the way he always built toward moments, by making you feel the current of good feeling so that the ask, when it came, would feel like the natural continuation of all of it rather than a departure. Then he slid the signature page fractionally closer to my side of the table, a gesture so small it was almost unconscious. Almost. "I think this is a good step for both of us," he said. I looked at the signature page for a moment, 3 seconds, maybe 4, long enough to let him read it as consideration. Then I opened my folder and slid my document across the table. He looked down at it. His expression moved through a sequence of adjustments. The first was confusion. The second was something recalibrating beneath the surface. And then he picked it up and started reading. For the first time in the 3 years I'd worked for him, Harlan Drexel went very, very quiet. Harlan read slowly. That was the first thing I noticed. He was a man who processed things quickly in every context I'd ever observed, who skimmed reports and interrupted presentations and finished other people's sentences, and now he was reading slowly. Page 1, page 2. The sound in the room was the air conditioning and the distant city and nothing else. I had chosen my chair carefully before he arrived. Not the one directly across from his at the conference table, where the signature page still sat with its artfully angled pen. The one at the corner, which put me at a slight angle to him and gave me a clear view of his face without the confrontational geometry of direct opposition. Old deposition trick. You want to watch someone read without it looking like you're watching them read. He reached the section with Dara's statement. I saw his jaw shift. Dara had written 3 paragraphs in the careful, factual language of someone who had spent 2 years deciding whether she'd ever say any of it out loud. She named dates. She named figures. $74,000 in documented lost billings, conservatively calculated across 18 months because she had been afraid. Not because the clause held up. Not because any court had weighed in. Because she'd received a letter, and she couldn't afford to find out what the letter actually meant. Harlan set page 2 face down on the table, picked up page 3. His expression had moved into a territory I recognized from my attorney years, the controlled stillness of someone who is doing very fast math. He set page 3 down, looked at me across the conference table. He had the smile he used when a client meeting was going wrong and he needed to reset the temperature in the room, practiced warm at the surface, carrying nothing underneath. "You think you're the first person to try to bluff me with a legal memo?" His voice was steady and almost friendly. "You've been here 3 years. I own this agency. I own every account you've touched. You're nothing here without my name on the door." I had prepared for some version of this. I'd known that his first move, if the document surprised him, would be to reframe it, to make it about hierarchy rather than law, to remind me of the disparity between his position and mine, as though that disparity would cause the case citations to uncite themselves. I didn't raise my voice. I'd learned a long time ago that the person who stays quietest in a room often has the most control of it. Your non-competes are worth exactly what a court will let you enforce, I said. Read page 4. He looked at me for one more moment, the look of a man deciding whether to keep performing or to pivot, and then he turned to page 4. The appellate ruling was 4 months shy of 2 years old. The plaintiff was an advertising and marketing firm based 2 states over, significantly smaller than Pinnacle and Drake, but the clause they'd attempted to enforce was nearly identical in structure: 150-mile radius, 36-month duration, broad definition of competing work. The defendant was a mid-level art director who'd left to go independent. The firm had sued to enforce. The court had not only ruled the clause void on reasonableness grounds across all 4 factors, but had found that the employer's legal action, given the overbreadth of the clause they knew they were enforcing, constituted bad faith. They'd awarded the defendant attorney's fees, paid by the employer. For bringing a case they should have known they couldn't win. I watched Harlan read it. I had the particular, specific pleasure of watching someone encounter a piece of information they cannot negotiate their way around. When he finished, he set the page down with the careful deliberateness of someone managing their own hands. I drafted tighter agreements than yours before you had a second office, I said. Not unkindly, simply as a fact, because it was one. The silence in the room was total. Outside the glass doors, I could hear the distant sound of the agency doing what it always did in mid-afternoon. Phone calls, someone laughing near the kitchen, the chime of an elevator. In here, Harlan Drexel was sitting very still and looking at a document that told him exactly how this would go if he chose to push it. He picked up the counter-proposal section, read it, set it down. 4 employees, he said, ready to file jointly with the State Labor Board if this isn't resolved. Yes. And you're prepared to sign a reasonable version, a narrowed version, direct competitor agencies, 12 months, clients I've personally managed, real consideration. I paused. I have no interest in being difficult, Harlan. I have interest in being protected, the same way you do. Something shifted in his face. Not capitulation exactly. Harlan wasn't built for gestures that large, but a recalculation that was visible if you knew what to look for. I'll need to speak with legal, he said. Of course. I stood and picked up my folder, leaving the counter-proposal document on the table. I left that copy for you. I walked out of his office, through the glass doors, past the receptionist who was pretending to be on a call, and to the elevator, inside, alone, descending. I let out a long, slow breath and felt the tension of the past 3 weeks move through me and out. Not relief, exactly. Something more like resolution. The particular satisfaction of a problem you've worked correctly arriving at the answer the math said it would. Priya called while I was still in the parking garage. How did it go? He's calling his lawyers, I said. A pause. Good call or bad call? Good call. His lawyers are going to read the memo and tell him what I told him. I unlocked my car. He's not going to like it, but he's going to do it. The fee-shifting ruling did the work. Page 4 did the work. She made a sound that was something between a laugh and a sigh. Buy me dinner. Absolutely, I said, but not until this is in writing. It took 11 days. I spent the first 3 of them doing exactly what I would have told any client to do, continuing to work, showing up, managing the Luminara pitch, which went well, better than well, actually. We landed it. Attending meetings, returning emails, being precisely as present and professional as I had been before any of this started. I did not discuss the situation with anyone in the office. I did not check in with Theo or Lynn or Jerome about what was happening, because anything I said could become part of a timeline that complicated things. I let the silence do its work. On the 4th day, Harlan's outside. Counsel, a boutique employment firm I recognized from several cases in my attorney years, sent Priya a letter requesting a preliminary call to discuss resolution. On the 7th day, Priya and their lead partner spent 90 minutes on the phone while I sat in my living room with a legal pad and a cup of tea I kept forgetting to drink. On the 11th day, I received a formal written offer from Pinnacle and Drake's counsel. I read it twice. Then I called Priya. They moved, she said, more than I expected. Honestly, they had. The proposed addendum was formally withdrawn. In its place, a revised optional non-compete addendum available to all senior staff. narrowed to direct competitor agencies in the metro market, 12 months duration with real consideration, a $15,000 retention bonus paid in 2 installments, genuinely optional, with a 90-day review period for employees to consult independent counsel before signing, optional, with time to read it, with real money attached. Marcus's situation had required separate handling, and it was the one part of the resolution that had genuinely surprised me, though in retrospect it shouldn't have. When Harlan's attorneys looked at the documentation of the signing environment, the email that tied the $2,000 bonus specifically to execution of the agreement, the way the addendum had been presented in the review meeting, the context of Marcus having been in a group setting where he'd been publicly enthusiastic about signing, they had their own concerns about validity, not just for Marcus. For everyone who'd signed under similar circumstances, the rescission offer to Marcus came from their side, not mine. He called me the afternoon he received it. Selene. His voice had a new quality in it. Not quite rattled, but recalibrated. Did you know this was coming? I knew the situation was being looked at. I said carefully, a pause. I just signed it. I didn't even read it. I know. I signed it for $2,000. Another pause. That's embarrassing. It's not, I said. They designed it to move fast. The bonus, the group framing, the review meeting setting. You weren't the only one. You were just the first one they asked. You didn't sign it. No, because you knew. Because I happened to have information, I said, and a specific professional background, neither of which you should have needed to protect you. He was quiet for a moment. I'm going to read the new one before I decide. Good, I said. That's exactly right. Dara's letter arrived from Pinnacle and Drake's legal team on a Wednesday, formal and carefully worded. The agency acknowledged that the cease and desist correspondence she had received 22 months prior had been sent in error as it pertained to the specific client engagement in question, and that she was under no restriction, contractual or otherwise, from pursuing any creative, marketing, or advertising work she chose. The letter did not acknowledge the $74,000 in lost billings. It did not say they were sorry, but it said she was free, in writing, on agency letterhead, and I knew from experience that the piece of paper you hold matters as much as what it says. She called me the evening she got it. We didn't talk for long. There wasn't much that needed saying. I spent 2 years being smaller than I needed to be, she said. I know. I want the 2 years back, a beat. But I'll take the letter. Keep it somewhere safe, I said. Print a copy. My own review resolution was finalized a week after that. The narrowed non-compete was exactly what I'd proposed. Direct competitor agencies, 12 months. Clients I'd personally managed in the preceding 24 months. Real terms, specific terms, terms that protected something actual. And the salary adjustment that came with the review, a 12% increase, was the number the agency had apparently arrived at when they looked at my billing attribution, my account relationships, and the crystalline clarity of what replacing me would cost them. Funny how a legal position can clarify a conversation that had been vague for 2 years. I signed the narrowed agreement with Priya's blessing and my own clear eyes, and I felt nothing complicated about it. This is what reasonable looks like. This is what both parties having something to protect looks like. I'd have signed something like this 4 years ago without a second thought. 2 weeks after everything was finalized, Priya and I had dinner at the Italian place on Meridian Street, the one with the wine list that required commitment and the tables close enough together that you kept your voice down naturally. We ordered a Barolo that deserved the price and talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with Harlan Drexel, and then, over the second glass, things that did. The red flags were all there from the beginning. I said, the scope. 150 miles isn't tied to any real client geography. It's just a number large enough to cover everything. The duration, 3 years, when even the most protective courts rarely uphold more than 18 months. The definition of competing work so broad, it would have covered me consulting for a nonprofit's marketing committee. The bonus, Priya said. The bonus. I turned my glass. $2,000 attached to a restriction worth potentially $500,000 in earnings. The math is the red flag. When the consideration is tiny relative to the burden, you're not being compensated for your agreement. You're being asked to sign before you notice the disparity. The one most people miss, Priya said, swirling her wine, is the urgency. When an employer wants you to sign something new during a performance review, When there's a bonus on the table and your manager is sitting across from you and everyone around you has already signed, the pressure isn't written anywhere in the document, but it's the most powerful clause in the whole thing, the one designed to keep you from reading the rest. He called it a loyalty program, I said. They always call it something. I looked at her across the table. She'd been doing this longer than I had, 8 years of employment law while I'd done 8 before leaving, and she still had the precise, unsentimental clarity about it that I remembered from law school. The clarity that comes from knowing that the law is a tool, and tools can be used for many purposes, and the purpose usually depends on who's holding it. "Thank you," I said, "for the memo, for the precedents." "Thank you for finding the right case," she said. "Page 4 was yours." "Page 4 was a gift," I said. "I found it at 11:30 at night on a Tuesday, and I almost missed it because I was skimming the citations. The finding is still the work." We finished the Barolo and walked out into the October air, colder now than it had been 3 weeks ago. The city doing its late evening rearrangement of light and sound. I felt something I hadn't felt in a while. Not the strategic clarity that had carried me through the previous weeks, but something quieter, the satisfaction of a thing done correctly, of having understood a situation fully and responded to it in kind. 3 months later, Harlan Drexel knocked on my office door. He did not usually knock. He was the kind of man who moved through his own agency as though momentum were a management philosophy, but he knocked, which told me something before he'd said a word, and he closed the door behind him, which told me more. The Meridian Collective account was up for renewal. They were a $4.1 million retail brand, the relationship 3 years old, built on a campaign strategy I'd developed from the ground up when they were a regional player, with a mid-market positioning problem and the ambition to be something larger. They were something larger now. Their CMO, a direct, careful woman named Rebecca Yoon, who communicated exclusively through very short emails that somehow contained everything, had made it clear in the preliminary renewal conversation that her preference was to continue working with the agency, but that her loyalty to the relationship was specific, personal. Harlan sat down across from my desk. It was the first time he'd done that since our negotiation, and I let myself notice it without remarking on it. "Rebecca Yoon wants to see you on the renewal call," he said. "I know," I said. "She emailed me directly." A beat. "I'd like you to lead the renewal cycle." I looked at him for a moment. He looked back. There was no warmth in it and no hostility. We had moved past both of those into something more honest, which was pure professional transaction. He needed something I had. I had what I had partly because I'd built it, and partly because I'd protected it. "I can do that," I said. "I'll need full account authority through the renewal." "You'll have it. And I'll need the supporting team confirmed before the first client call." "Done." I nodded. "Then yes, I'll lead it." He stood, straightened his jacket, and left. He didn't say thank you. I didn't expect him to. Gratitude wasn't the transaction we were in. Mutual utility was, and I had made myself very difficult to replace, and he had finally fully understood that. The Meridian renewal closed 8 weeks later. Rebecca Yoon signed a 3-year extension. The commission attribution to my account went to $4.1 million. And then, when Meridian added 2 subsidiary brands to the scope in the second month of the new contract, to $5.3 million. 6 months after the confrontation in Harlan's office, I was sitting at my desk on the 22nd floor on a Thursday evening. The city was doing what it did, lit and moving, indifferent and magnificent, all those stacked rectangles of other people's late nights. The cleaning crew had come and gone. The floor was mine. On my screen was a new employment agreement. Not mine in the sense of one I'd been handed. Mine in the sense that a competing agency had sent it to me after 6 weeks of conversations that had started with a recruiter's LinkedIn message and ended with a call from the agency's managing partner who'd said, without preamble, what would it take? The offer was extraordinary. $500,000 in guaranteed first-year compensation, an equity stake that vested over 4 years with a 2-year cliff, a leadership title that came with actual authority over the creative division, and a non-compete clause that I had already redlined twice, knocking the radius from 75 miles to 30, the duration from 24 months to 12, and removing an overly broad definition of competing work that would have applied to work I might do as a board member of a nonprofit. My counter was in a draft email, the 3rd draft. I'd written it once, revised it with Priya's input on a Saturday morning phone call, and revised it again myself on Tuesday night. It was specific, and it was clear, and it asked for what I actually wanted, without apology and without performance. It laid out what I brought and what I needed in return, and it drew the line I wasn't willing to step over. I looked at the city for a long moment. The elevated train threw its sparks near the Millbrook overpass. A cab moved through the grid below. Somewhere down there, Dara Washington was working, really working, the way she'd been built to work, without the shadow of an overreaching letter dimming the radius of what she'd let herself try. I hit send. She had spent her career reading the fine print for other people. It turned out it was even better when you read it for yourself.